Now back to the problem of acceptance. As you learned last time, the drafter of an offer can change the rules for acceptance, provided the action the offer declares to be assent is reasonably interpreted as assent under the circumstances. A dual-purpose document a drafter presents as one thing, such as a ticket for admission, but that also presents terms of a contract can lead to an issue whether the offeree's assent was knowing and voluntary. Why do you enter a theater after paying for a ticket? Because you paid for a ticket and drove across town to see the show. Entering a theater is not necessarily understood to be assent to additional contract terms on the back of the ticket unless the rule was presented in a conspicuous form and manner. I'll address this problem again later this semester in the materials on procedural unconscionability. Here's one more way a drafter of an offer might change the rules of acceptance. It might declare that the offeree manifests assent by beginning to perform, such as by beginning construction, beginning manufacturing, starting to work, or putting goods on a truck. This might sound surprising because you learned earlier that if the offer invites acceptance of a contract in which the offeree will be bound by a promise, acceptance must be by some reasonable act of communication with the offeror, like, yes, I accept and will be bound by that promise. Starting to work, standing alone, doesn't manifest a promise to finish in the usual case. I start a lot of things I don't finish. I didn't promise I'd finish. You might wonder why an offeror would want the offeree's beginning to perform to be acceptance. Wouldn't that put the offeror at even greater risk of being bound by a contract without knowing it for days? The idea that an offeror might define acceptance as starting to perform, implying a promise to finish, probably occurred first to merchants trading at very great distances. A buyer sent an offer by ship. It arrived 2 weeks later in Amsterdam. The first time this happened, the seller read his mail, then ran back to the harbor to hand his acceptance to a ship's captain. Take this letter to Houston, Texas. Then the seller ran back to his warehouse, loaded the goods on his cart, and rowed back to the harbor again. He transferred the goods to a sailing ship. Take these goods to Houston, Texas. Then he rowed back to his office. When he caught his breath, he realized, I could have done that in one trip. Why did I take 2 trips? The seller wrote another letter to the buyer. Next time you send me an order, please authorize me to accept just by shipping the goods. You don't need me to waste time writing and mailing a letter to you. A letter would probably arrive on the same boat as the goods anyway. When you get the goods, you'll know I accept it. That seemed like a good idea to the buyer, too. Aren't all buyers anxious to get their stuff as soon as possible? If the seller could accept just by shipping the goods, that might reduce total transaction time by a few days. There could be other circumstances when an offeror would have a reason to invite acceptance by beginning performance, manifesting a promise to complete the performance. Still, an offer's invitation to accept by beginning performance is unusual, and so it must be very clear if it's intended. And remember, if beginning performance is acceptance, beginning also manifests a promise to finish if the offer required a promise by the offeree. This brings us to our first case for today, White versus Corley's and Tift, where a customer made an offer and the contractor claimed to have accepted by beginning the work. Did the offer clearly invite acceptance by beginning to work? To put this failed transaction in context, let's start at the top. The customer had asked the contractor for a bid based on different specifications. As each bid came in, the customer realized the cost was too high or perhaps low enough to allow more expensive work, and the customer changed its specifications and asked for a new bid. Estimating a bid takes a lot of work by a building contractor. Don't underestimate the work of preparing a bid based on a prediction about the materials and labor for a job. The contractor had gone through at least his second bid and had assented to it. Probably the court meant the contractor made an offer, and the contractor was expecting an acceptance after all this work. Will the customer finally make up its mind? The customer replied on September 29. Upon an agreement to finish in 2 weeks, you can begin at once. The writer will call again probably between 5 and 6 this p.m. This is a lesson in how not to write clearly. This letter aims in all directions at once. No wonder the contractor was confused. Let's start with the question whether this letter was an acceptance of the contractor's offer. The parties in the court appear to have assumed it was not an acceptance. Why not? If the contractor did make an offer, the customer's response suggested they had a deal. The words upon an agreement might mean in the present tense, we have an agreement. But then comes the next phrase, to finish in 2 weeks. Did the customer's letter add a deadline that was not in the contractor's offer? My experience with building contractors is that they rarely volunteer a deadline for their work. The customer seemed to add a 2-week deadline. Remember that adding a single new or different term, no matter how insignificant, terminates the offer. It's a counteroffer. That's why the court started with the customer's September 29 letter. This was the offer that may or may not have been accepted by the contractor. How was the contractor to accept? The contractor, who was in a hurry to finish negotiations and get to work, focused on the words, "You can begin at once." In isolation, that certainly looks like an invitation to start right away. Beginning the work might be a proper way to manifest assent with a promise to finish. But I warned you, this letter is a mess. Remember the first words of the letter, upon an agreement. At first, we considered that these words meant the parties already had a contract. But no one involved in the case appears to have interpreted the letter that way on appeal. It turns out there's a second way to read that phrase. It might mean when we have an agreement. The word upon in this context is ambiguous. It might mean now, or it might mean when we have an agreement. The customer might have meant, when I hear from you that you assent to this 2-week deadline, then we will have an agreement and then you can begin at once. In other words, the customer wanted the contractor's assent in the usual way, by communication with the customer to assent to a promise to complete the work in 2 weeks. Another part of the customer's letter confirms that the customer expected the contractor to communicate its acceptance in a normal fashion. It's the last sentence. The writer will call again probably between 5 and 6 this p.m. The customer wanted to hear the acceptance from the contractor. That's why the customer was going to visit later that evening for a face-to-face meeting to receive the contractor's oral or written acceptance. The contractor must have thought, finally we have a deal. Well, not quite. But the contractor went out to buy materials that very day. Unfortunately, something happened during the hours between the delivery of the customer's letter and the evening of the same day when the contractor expected the customer to visit. The customer changed its mind. It countermanded its offer to the contractor before the contractor could accept by saying yes. The poor contractor. If it had gone straight to the offeror's office instead of going to the store, it might have won this case. It's not hard to see how an anxious and hopeful contractor, especially one not well versed in the law of offer and acceptance, could read that letter and interpret it as saying, go now. Considering how confusing the customer's letter was, why didn't the court side with the contractor? Because the presumption is that acceptance must be by communication, and an offeror who intends to allow acceptance by starting to work must be very clear to overcome the presumption. White versus Corley's and Tiff suggests that the offer must be free of ambiguity in allowing acceptance by beginning performance. For an example of an offer clear enough to invite acceptance by beginning to perform, we have Evertight versus Green. Evertight is also a modern example of why the drafter of the offer might want to allow acceptance by beginning to perform. Evertight had a roofing business. It drafted a form to be used by customers to make offers back to Evertight. This is one of those cases in which the drafter wanted to be the offeree with the other party making the offer. This allows Evertight to check its work capacity and compare with received orders before it committed to performing the work. It also allowed Evertight to check the credit rating of customers before committing to performing the work. That explains why Evertight wanted a customer to be the offeror, with Evertight as the offeree reserving the right to accept or not accept depending on work capacity, backlog, and customer creditworthiness. But Evertight also drafted the offer form, and it defined for itself how it could accept. It could accept by starting to perform. Here's the language in the offer form. This agreement shall become binding only upon written acceptance hereof by the principal or authorized officer of the contractor, or upon commencing performance of the work. It's clear that Evertight was the offeree because the agreement was not to be binding until Evertight accepted. Evertight's acceptance could be either written notice by an authorized officer or commencing performance of the work. Maybe Evertight was giving itself some cover. An office worker might forget to dispatch a letter, or a manager might assemble a work crew and supplies forgetting to send a letter. Either way, there would be acceptance. The Greens placed an order with one of Evertight's salespersons. Then they waited for 9 days. Is it possible the offer lapsed in that time? The issue wasn't raised, but that would be the fault of the Greens or their lawyer. I'm not sure they would have won on that issue. Construction work can move slowly, and 9 days isn't necessarily an unreasonable time to accept an offer, but it might be. For one reason or another, the Greens changed their minds. They hired another company to fix their roof. Perhaps they received a lower bid. This action was inconsistent with the Greens' offer to Evertight, but it wasn't revocation of the offer because Evertight didn't get notice of it, not until it was too late. Evertight decided to accept the Greens' offer. No need to send written notice because Evertight's work crew could get there as quickly as a written notice. Evertight assembled a work crew, loaded 2 trucks with materials and equipment, and drove, by my estimate, nearly an hour to the Greens' home. When they arrived, another work crew was already on the scene. When Evertight observed that the Greens had hired another crew, And when the Greens sent Evertite away, it was certainly clear that the Greens had acted inconsistently with intending to assent to their offer. That would be revocation, except that Evertite had already accepted by starting to perform. This might not be as clear a case as it seems. The court seemed to assume that assembling a work crew, loading a truck, and driving nearly an hour each way was beginning performance. The court was probably impressed by the amount of effort Evertite had put into getting ready to perform. But does preparing or getting ready to perform constitute beginning to perform? Here's what Restatement Section 50 says. Acceptance by performance means performance or tender of at least part of what the offer requested. What did this offer request? It requested roof repair. Did Evertite actually perform any part of the roof repair? No. It did a lot of preparation. On the other hand, Section 50 also says that acceptance by performance can mean tender of what was requested. What's tender? Tender is presenting, offering, and being ready to perform whatever was requested. Evertite didn't actually perform any part of what was requested, but it did tender by showing up at the Greens' house ready, willing, and able to perform. The assembling and loading and driving weren't acceptance. Arriving at the Greens' house ready, willing, and able to perform was acceptance. There's one more missing piece to this case. Why didn't Evertite call ahead?
Hey, good afternoon.
This wasn't in the era of sailing ships and Pony Express. Evertite surely had a telephone, and so did the Greens. Would a telephone call be in order? Imagine you placed an order for work by the cable guy at your house or apartment. You hear nothing for 9 days, and suddenly the cable guy just shows up at your home as you're getting ready to go to school. Don't worry, he says. I'll be okay alone in your apartment. And by the way, do you have any good snacks in your refrigerator? At the very least, you expect a contractor to say what day they will arrive and perhaps an estimate of the time. I'd be pretty angry with a contractor who assumed it could show up any day of the week and any time without some advance warning to confirm I'd be home and to make sure it would be a good time for me. There was no advance notice here. That, at the very least, was impolite. Did it violate any duty under contract law? Maybe. Take a look at Restatement Section 56. It is essential to an acceptance by promise either that the offeree exercise reasonable diligence to notify the offeror of acceptance, or that the offeror receive the acceptance seasonably. This rule might be important for a case like Evertite. If the offeree knows that beginning to perform will not in itself notify the offeror of the acceptance, the offeree has a duty to notify the offeror by separate measure, by communicating. A telephone call would certainly have been in order here. Why didn't Evertite call ahead and say, we've accepted, we're loading the truck? It appears that question was never asked. On the other hand, I'm not sure it would have made any difference in the end. Even if Evertite had called ahead that morning, the case might have come out the same way. Evertite probably would have accepted on the phone, and the Greens would have breached because they were in no position to allow Evertite to perform work that was already being done by another crew. Next, we have Corinthian Pharmaceuticals versus Ladurel Laboratories, a case that illustrates acceptance by another type of performance, shipping goods. The days of sailing ships are long gone, but there are still reasons why parties might dispense with the usual requirement of acceptance by communication and allow acceptance by shipment. Let's imagine the setting in which a buyer and seller of goods allow acceptance by shipment. The seller is a regular supplier of the buyer. Because the seller ships goods regularly to the buyer, the form of their contract is established. They use the same terms over and over again, so there's no need to negotiate over details with each new order. If it's a so-called just-in-time operation, the buyer orders goods right when it's about to run out of supply. It needs the next shipment right away before it runs out completely. Under UCC Section 2-206, if a buyer makes an order for prompt or current shipment, that means now, without delay. I know what your form says, or you know what my form says, so forget sending another form. Just send the goods right away. If the seller responds quickly, either by saying yes or by shipping the goods, we have a contract. But remember, acceptance by starting performance also manifests a promise to finish if the offer was for a contract that required a promise by the seller. What could possibly go wrong? Buyer makes an order for 200 gizmos. Seller sees the order and calls its warehouse. Ship 200 gizmos right away. A warehouse clerk gets ready to load the truck. Was it gizmos or was it gadgets? It was gadgets. He loads the truck with 200 gadgets and sends the driver on her way. Do we have a contract? Yes. Under 2-206, if an offer invites or permits shipment as a form of acceptance, shipment manifests acceptance even if the seller shipped the wrong goods. Accepting an order for gizmos by shipping gadgets is still acceptance. And if the seller manifested assent to a contract requiring the seller to promise, the seller is now bound by a promise to get the right goods to the buyer on time. The truck with gadgets arrives at the buyer's place of business, and buyer is outraged. These aren't the gizmos I ordered. Don't you know a gizmo from a gadget? Get me those gizmos I ordered. And seller does have a contractual obligation to deliver gizmos pronto.
4,000.
Now, there are times a seller might deliver the wrong thing on purpose. Not really the wrong thing. Better to say, not what was ordered. Maybe the seller saw the order for gizmos and thought, gee, we're flat out of gizmos.
Okay, check it out.
We do have gadgets, which are almost exactly like gizmos. We're sending a truck to deliver other orders anyway. Why not just put some gadgets on the truck and offer them as a solution? The buyer can take them or leave them. In commercial practice, this is called an accommodation. The seller offers a substitute for what the buyer wanted with the hope that the buyer will find the substitute acceptable. You could also say this is a counteroffer by shipment. I do not accept your order offer for gizmos because I have no gizmos. I present gadgets. Every bit as
okay,
good
well, exterior
as
is ready now. So if you want to...
is the seller accepting the offer?
If you want to start exterior...
Is the seller now
it's saying
bound to
start
deliver
interior.
gizmos it doesn't have because it shipped gadgets in response to the offer for current or prompt shipment? No. The seller was clear that it did not accept. Instead,
I'm going to send you a
it
link
offered
to
an accommodation.
to fill out like your ID and all that. That way we can create a contract, and then we'll go from there.
An accommodation was what happened in
Okay, I'm gonna send you right now.
pharmaceuticals versus
right,
Ladural
thanks.
Laboratories. Ladural was a regular supplier of vaccine for Corinthian. Ladural typically shipped 100 vials at a time. One day, Ladural found it necessary to radically increase the price per vial. It kept the decision secret, probably because it knew that if the news got out, buyers would flood Ladurl with orders to get ahead of the price increase. Somehow, Corinthian found out about the planned price increase. It's possible that this involves some wrongdoing on the part of Corinthian. Could this be a case of corporate espionage? Corinthian hatched a plan. It ordered 10 times as much as its usual shipment, 10 times more than it could possibly use during the usual shelf life of the product. Probably, Corinthian hoped it could buy low and resell high after the price increase took effect. What good is corporate espionage if you can't profit from it? Ladurl received the order and decided not to let Corinthian have its way. In response to Corinthian's order for 1,000 at the old price, Ladurl shipped just 50 at the old price, with an offer to send the remaining 950 vials at the new, much higher price. "Breach," Corinthian proclaimed. "Your shipment was non-conforming, but it was in response to our order. You accepted our order, and now you owe us the entire 1,000 vials we ordered at the old price." Did Ladurl walk into a trap? No. Ladurl was cleverer than Corinthian. Ladurl had made it clear it offered the 50 vials as an accommodation. It was not accepting the order. In effect, it made a counteroffer, and it was clear enough in its messaging that it did not assent to be bound by Corinthian's terms. It was then up to Corinthian to accept this accommodation or not. No breach by Ladurl. By now you can see that a lot can go wrong between offer, acceptance, and contract formation. A lot of confusion can happen when the drafter of the offer plays with the rules of acceptance. This leads to our next topic of mutual assent. Mutual assent by performance after a failed acceptance. What happens if an offeror sends an offer, the offeree accepts in the wrong way, and then the parties perform as if they have a contract? In other words, what happens if we have a failed acceptance followed by mutual performance? The seller delivers, the buyer pays, and later they have a dispute, perhaps over the quality of the goods. Do they have a contract or an accident? Remember, contracts do not exist based on offer and acceptance. Contracts exist based on mutual assent, which is ordinarily but not always established by offer and acceptance. This brings us to our last case for this lecture, Allied Steel versus Ford. Allied and Ford were another pair of companies who had settled into a routine. Ford's factory regularly needed Allied's services to erect new equipment for the factory. The parties used the same form over and over again, although the case does set out some of the history of amendments to that form. We'll focus on the fact that Allied failed to accept in the appropriate manner. Ford's offer order said, if you accept, sign this form and return it to Ford. Allied's office received the order offer and assembled a work crew, equipment, and supplies. Back in the office, what happened to the form? Someone dropped it in a file folder, unsigned, and not returned to Ford. This oversight ordinarily would have had zero consequence. Allied's crew arrived at Ford, and the security guard instantly recognized them. It's the Allied crowd. Come on in. No paperwork necessary. Allied's crew got into the factory and got straight to work. They knew the drill. No one at Ford questioned or objected. After all, Ford ordered this work. Ford was expecting it. Did Ford receive the paperwork? It's probably back in that stack of mail in the office. Again, the mistake would have been of no consequence if not for a dispute about an industrial accident that depended in part on the terms of Ford's order form, its written offer. Did Allied accept the offer? Was there a contract to govern the dispute over the industrial accident? You might be wondering at this point, didn't we just say that starting to perform can be acceptance? Well, yes, that would make this an easy case, but it's not quite that easy here. Starting to perform can be acceptance of an offer requiring a promise if the offer is clear in allowing such acceptance. Ford's offer was not that kind of offer. It demanded acceptance by communication. The court considered first whether the order offer really required Allied to sign and return the order as the only way to accept. Let's go straight to the more important part of the court's opinion. When the usual rules of offer and acceptance break down and there's no acceptance based on the applicable rules, the parties might manifest their assent to a contract based on the offer by their performance of the contract. Allied began to perform. Allied performed on Ford's property in full view of Ford's managers and security guards. Ford accepted Allied's work. Mr. Fly is sitting on the ceiling of the Ford plant and can see Allied intended to assent to Ford's order offer. Maybe Allied accepted in the wrong way, but Ford has not objected despite full knowledge that Allied is working on the property right now. Ford doesn't care that Allied accepted the wrong way. Ford has accepted Allied's acceptance. Do we have a deal? Yes, and it's all referable to Ford's form. That's all for now. Next time, we'll discuss the special problem of acceptance of an offer that does not require a promise by the offeree, an offer proposing a classic unilateral contract.